You're listening to the SMD Radio Podcast. In the first segment of today's episode, Bob Farrell and Craig Coleman of Signalysis had the pleasure of sitting down with Jerry Nieb to talk about his association with the Yamaha MotoGP factory racing team. Let's have a listen.
Okay, so Jerry, I saw in the recent Signalysis newsletter a little bit of a short interview with you that talked about your experience with Yamaha motors. Is that something you want to talk a little bit more about this morning? Can you give us some background on that?
Sure, I can do that. If you are okay with it, I'll start with the ancient history where it all began. Let's
get into it then.
Okay, so the ancient history kind of starts in about 1980, where I found myself working for, I think it was 6 or 8 weeks at Johnson Space Center. And how that came about was I was working with a company called SDRC at the time. And SDRC was a very interesting place to work where it was a consulting company. And SDRC's even older history than that was they started out as a testing company where they called themselves sophisticated troubleshooters, where they went around going out on the road with some equipment that would have been regarded as super high tech at the time and tried to solve people's mainly vibration problems, but other vibration problems with equipment also. So anyway, what we were doing at Johnson Space Center is we had a project with NASA to do ground testing on a lot of the space shuttle components. So the time I was down there, we were working on the what was called the OMS pod, which is the Orbital Maneuvering System pod, and the RCS pod, the Reentry Control System pod. And it turned out that Bob Coleman was in charge of that project. So that's when I first, Signalysis didn't exist at that time, but that's when I first met Bob Coleman. Bob is probably, hopefully a lot of people that are listening to this know that Bob is Neil Coleman, the president of Signalysis' father. And so I had already known Neil because Neil worked at SDRC with me at the time. So
was Bob with SDRC or at NASA? Where was Bob at this time?
Bob actually, I believe, was employed by Northrop. So Northrop was a contractor for NASA at the time. And who was at Johnson Space Center at that time were a lot of NASA contractors. So NASA is kind of the governing body of anything that happens in space, but they employ a lot of private company contractors. So Northrop was there, and Boeing was there, and several of the other aerospace companies were involved in the space shuttle project. But anyway, I totally got off track there from Yamaha, but the way I first heard the name associated with my career, the way I first heard the name Yamaha associated with career was when I was at and just getting ready to end the project down in Johnson Space Center. And somebody from SDRC called me and said, hey, we got your next project lined up. So what we did at SDRC was kind of went from project to project, whichever things came up, and the jobs got assigned to whichever engineer they thought would be the right guy to do it. So they approached me, do you want to be involved in this Yamaha project when you get back from NASA? Well, yeah, that was like feeding raw meat to a hungry tiger at the time.
Yamaha as in motorcycles, or
this was motorcycle, and the Yamaha is involved in a whole lot of people associate the name Yamaha with motorcycles, but Yamaha is involved
racing, commercial.
This was a street motorcycle that the project involved, so it was the Yamaha motorcycle group that the project was for. And at the time, I was a very young engineer, so I was only 2 or 3 years out of college at the time. And so I was kind of wet behind the ears, I guess you might say, when this project was introduced to me. But like I said, it was like feeding raw meat to a hungry tiger, because I've been a motorcycle nut ever since I was 14 years old. I started. My first ticket I ever got was for riding a motorcycle without a driver's license. That's how So I was just motorcycle crazy. So. I guess somebody at SDRC knew I was. Of course, there was a lot of us motorcycle crazy at SDRC, so everybody was jealous of me for being appointed to this project. So as soon as I got back from NASA, I started on the Yamaha project. Whoever designed this project, whoever proposed this project, Yamaha, I'm not sure who that was or how that came about, but whoever did it was very clever, because it was like a technology transfer project. So part of my assignment was to teach a guy that was going to come over from Japan, from Yamaha, teach him what we were doing. But the clever part of this project was combining just the technology transfer aspects of it with a practical problem. So that what was done very, very well. It's so much easier to work on something with somebody else and show them what they're doing when you have a goal in mind. Whereas if all you have to do is teach them something, it's much more difficult. I know that because I've had part of my career later was to be a instructor for mechanical engineering at Cincinnati State Technical College. And I know it's much, much harder to get ideas and concepts and how to do things across to students when you're just doing it from an academic standpoint than when you're applying it to a practical project.
So are you allowed to elaborate on, you mentioned troubleshooting being a part of your job at the time. Was this associated with a problem Yamaha was having, or is that something you can disclose? Or
no, it might have been secret at the time, but it's getting close to 40 years ago, so I don't think it's secret anymore. Yeah, it involved a problem with a motorcycle they were producing at the time called the RD350 LC. So motorcycle guys will very readily recognize the name Yamaha RD350. The LC part stood for liquid cooled. So they were turning the really well-received RD350 motorcycle, which was an air-cooled 350 twin-cylinder, into liquid-cooled to get more horsepower out of it. And it also had a lot to do with improving the emission. It was a two-stroke engine, so it had a lot to do with improving the emissions requirements, so on and so forth. Well, anyway, to make a long story short, one of the big problems that the RD350 had, it was a fantastic motorcycle, but one of the main problems that it had was because it was a 180-degree crankshaft twin cylinder, that engine configuration is inherently susceptible to what's called a secondary unbalance. The pistons go up and down opposite each other, and that creates a torque in the engine, which causes a high-frequency vibration. And so Yamaha wanted to solve that problem. Well, they had a young, clever engineer that solved that problem on this motorcycle. So he invented, got a patent on it, what was called the orthogonal engine mounting system on this motorcycle. And the orthogonal engine mounting system worked fantastic. It almost completely eliminated that secondary unbalance. It didn't eliminate the vibration, but it caused the engine to vibrate on its own and not transmit those vibrations. It was an isolation system that caused the vibrations to be restricted to the engine and not get transmitted into the frame, so the rider basically couldn't feel the vibration. But as it turned out, a secondary effect of it was there was a certain RPM where the engine vibration that was still there caused the exhaust system to go into resonance. So there was one particular speed where the vibration from the exhaust system was really, really bad, and the rider could feel it. And that was the basic problem that we were attacking with this project.
What do you mean feel it? Was it something that was potentially a safety hazard, or is it just made?
No, it was. It's just rider comfort. It wasn't really a safety hazard. It wasn't going to cause any failure problems on the motorcycle, but it was just a speed where all of a sudden the rider started feeling a buzzing in the handlebars and possibly a buzzing in the rear end sitting on the seat. And so they could tell the motorcycle was the rest of the RPM range. The bike had become so quiet, so smooth, without any vibration, that when you got into this one RPM range where there was vibration, it was very, very noticeable to the rider. And so that's what we were trying to eliminate.
So how was that problem solved? What was your process for that?
To be honest, I'm not sure we ever did solve it. We knew the cause of the problem, and we had some proposals as a way to alleviate that problem. I think we alleviated it to a certain extent by changing the way the header pipes were coming out of the engine. We put in a little bit of an isolation, not a coupling is not the right word, but there's like a little isolation spring and damping part that went in between the exhaust header and the engine that somewhat reduced that vibration. It didn't solve it completely, it was still there, but at least reduced the vibration. And that motorcycle went out of production before they had a chance to implement anything more sophisticated than that.
So I kind of remember reading in the interview that project led to a relationship with the CEO of the company or something along those lines. Is that correct?
Right, exactly. So I hadn't got to the crux of the story yet. So what I was assigned to be the project manager and the project engineer on that. And so what Yamaha did, since it was primarily supposed to be a technology transfer project, they sent an engineer from Japan to work with us at SDRC for 5 months. So a guy who had never been to the United States before came from Japan. He was going to live in outside of Cincinnati in Claremont County, where SDRC was located at the time, and he was going to be there for 5 months. And me being the project manager, I was kind of his caretaker, so to speak. Well, he was a young, eager, very, very sharp, very, very intelligent engineer, and he was in what was called their first R&D division at the time. So he wasn't, I didn't think anyway he was anything special. I just thought he was a good engineer that Yamaha assigned to this project. But anyway, he was a Japanese guy, and he spoke English, but he didn't have any practical experience in speaking English. So a lot of Japanese, especially college-educated Japanese, study the English language, but they never talk to an American or an Englishman to actually have practical experience using the English language. So he knew a lot of English words, but he didn't essentially know how to use them in an American conversation. So and I had no knowledge of anything to do with Japan at the time. But anyway, he was a motorcycle guy, and so that interested me. So I took an interest in him, and anyway, I became his caretaker while he was in Cincinnati, and we did all kinds of things together in off hours. And so I got to be good friends with him, and hopefully he got to be good friends with me at the same time. He got intimately familiar with everything there was to know about Cincinnati through the course of this project, and that's how I got to know him. And that we hit it off so well that relationship just kind of continued. And so it ended up that I'm still friends with him. I'm still communicating with him, and I've been at his house actually in Japan and stayed at his house.
So he went on to become CEO. Is that what?
And he went. Yeah, he went. It would take me a long time to tell you the progression of his career, but he went from just a young engineer in their R&D division, who I would say was probably pretty obscure with, Yamaha employs, I think, probably 50,000 people or more worldwide. So he was just one of the 50,000, but he did some things in his career that he just kept getting more and more recognition for the things that he did for the company, that he eventually ended up being the CEO of all of Yamaha, not just the motorcycle division, but the entire Yamaha Motor Company. So you just never know how things are going to turn out. So I didn't become friends with him because I thought he was going to be CEO of Yamaha. We were just engineers who enjoyed talking about engineering and also enjoyed motorcycles together. And so that just worked out.
Well, how about today? Do you stay in touch? Or?
Yeah, I'm still in touch with him. He's retired now, so I think he retired. He was CEO when he retired, and I'm thinking he retired somewhere around 2013, 2014, something like that. I have to go back and make sure, but he's been retired for a few years. But the interesting thing about him being CEO is that also, I'm not sure if every CEO did it. I don't think every CEO did this, but for some reason he did this. He became the head of their MotoGP racing team as part of being the CEO of Yamaha. Maybe it was just because he was such a motorcycle and racing enthusiast that he just decided to appoint himself the head of their MotoGP racing team. But as a result of that, I got intimately involved with the MotoGP racing team for a while too, and that was really a highlight and a fun part of my career.
Well, why don't we? That's an interesting topic. We could get into that in more detail in a future podcast if you've got time and if you are interested in doing that.
Sure.
And
Love
maybe
to.
Maybe we can also talk a little bit more in detail about some of the things that lessons learned and how it impacted your career, your involvement with the project, and maybe some similar projects as the Yamaha.
Yeah, sure. Love to do that. Just when you mentioned lessons learned, looking back on that, I think I mentioned that I was an instructor down at Cincinnati State for a number of years. One of the things that I tried to impart to my students was not just engineering knowledge, but also just some life experience knowledge. When you get to be my age, there's only so much more new engineering information you can absorb, but what you realize is practical world experience in dealing with people is just as important, or maybe more important than just having technical engineering knowledge. So one of the key lessons that I learned from that experience is, you should always treat people, like one of the reasons I think they appointed me to this Yamaha project was because everybody else at STRC who was a motorcycle enthusiast that would have liked to work on that project, they probably had a fuller life than I had at the time, and they weren't interested in spending a lot of off hours trying to nursemaid some Japanese guy that didn't speak English very well for 5 months. And so, but for me, that was an ideal situation for me at the time. And what I'm getting at is what I learned from that is, no matter how painful it might be to deal with somebody or your reaction to somebody, to always treat them with respect, because you never just know where you're going to turn out and where they're going to turn out in life. Just to always keep that in mind, no matter who you're dealing with and what you're dealing with them for.
Well, he's probably back home telling stories about you, so.
Yeah, his stories about me may not be quite so favorable as my stories about him.
On a future podcast.
He would actually probably do that. He would like to do that, and so with technology today, he could probably do it and still stay in Japan.
That's right.
He wouldn't have to come from Japan to the United States.
Fly him over here.
Right. Yeah, but he'd probably be willing to do that.
Okay. So. Well, let's pencil that
maybe
in.
I should mention his name just so everybody could make sure that I'm not just blowing smoke, and this is a real guy. His name is Masao Furusawa. In English, it's spelled Furusawa. So if you just Google Furusawa, you'll probably come up with his name as the first hit. And he's got his own Wikipedia page and describes his exploits with it. His main fame came from being with the MotoGP racing team, but his actual more important role in life was being CEO of Yamaha. That's a much more huge responsibility than being the head of the MotoGP racing team, but he got a lot more press and a lot more fame out of being with the racing team. So.